Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm Louisa Savage. I'm executive editor for growth at Politico, and we're incredibly proud to be a media partner for the Halifax International Security Forum. As a transatlantic news organization in the United States, in Europe, and in Canada, this is a wonderful forum for us to partner on. This panel today, I don't think an hour is going to be enough, so we'll consider this just the beginning of what I think is one of the most important conversations at this forum. We have an unbelievable panel of so many incredible experts and perspectives from several parts of the alliance here, so this is going to be incredibly educational. I'm just going to introduce our panel from the far end, coming closer in. Laurent Resekis is Executive Director of Gas Power and Renewables at S&P Global Commodity Insights. And I had the distinct pleasure of sitting next to him on the bus from the airport this morning, and I basically got a master class in energy analysis this morning, so I'm hoping he'll bring that to our conversation today. Next to him, it is my absolute honor to introduce Ambassador Yulia Kovalev, who is Ukraine's ambassador to Canada. And not only that, but she was an energy regulator before that and sat on the board of Ukraine's biggest gas companies. So she has a wealth of expertise as well. Next to the ambassador is General Raymond Andrzejczak, and he is the chief of the general staff of the Polish Armed Forces. And we had an incredible conversation yesterday outside the bar, so I can't wait to share some of his insights as well. Next to him is Nancy Southern, the chair and CEO of ATCO Limited, ATCO and Canadian Utilities Limited. And I have to say, I grew up in Calgary, and those ATCO trailers are an indelible part of my childhood. So great to have you here as well for a Canadian perspective. And next to me, straight from Camelot, Sir Michael Arthur, the president of Boeing International, who's here from the UK and has a really global perspective on the future of industry, the future of aviation as well. So we're very excited to have him here. So this is just a great group of people, but I think where I'd like to start this conversation is, I think, what's on all of our minds, which is the situation right now on the ground in Ukraine. Ambassador, there have been many severe attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. What is happening there right now on the ground? And going into this cold winter, are we going to be able to rebuild that infrastructure in time?
Thank you for that question. And actually, one of the instruments of Russia's war in Ukraine, except for the tanks, except for the missiles that hit throughout the country, is actually using the energy as a weapon. We saw it from the very beginning of the war when Russia was threatening not only Ukraine by using energy, but also threatening the unity of our allies, using the gas as a power to heat this coalition of the countries supporting Ukraine. But we also showed the unity, and as we heard also yesterday on the panel, everybody is more confident on this winter on the European continent. And within the recent attacks, especially the one that was on Tuesday this week, Russia specifically hit the electricity infrastructure throughout all of the country. We estimate that around 40% of all of the electricity infrastructure have been destroyed or massively hit with these missiles attacks throughout 40% of all of the infrastructure. And of course, this Russia is trying to break the morale of Ukrainians, because the winter is coming. The winter is very cold in Ukraine, probably not so cold as in Canada, but it's still snow and quite a low temperature. And as we are sitting today in a beautiful hall with a lot of light, many of Ukrainians for many hours a day have no electricity at all. And this war showed also us many things that we took for granted. Like, you just enter the room, switch on the light, and you have it. You can prepare the food. You can be in your warm house in winter. What Russia is doing now is depriving Ukrainians of those basic needs, which is also a genocide against the Ukrainian people, having no ability even to to connect with their parents, because if you don't have the electricity, for many cities, you just don't have the mobile connection, which makes the life very hard to Ukrainians. Another thing which is a big threat, both for Ukraine, but for the global security, is the nuclear. This is the first time when, during the war, the nuclear power facilities, civilian one, has been hit. We all remember within the first days of the war, Russian troops occupying Chernobyl nuclear station. Now Zaporizhzhia nuclear station. It's the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe. For the months is under the occupation. And the significant threat around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant makes all us to think about the security of the nuclear. And security not only for us in Ukraine, but that is a big global threat for that. In terms of the rebuilding, and I think we will talk a bit on that panel today on how we see this rebuilding, it is happening already. And we have huge number of thousands of the heroes. These are the electricity workers that work in 24/7, just each day reconnecting, being innovative to try to deliver electricity with the shortest terms. And in order to help us, because this is the most massive attack on the huge critical infrastructure for the country, we launched the same format as we were dealing with the defense and the military support, which we call Rammstein. Now we launched the energy Rammstein. Taking on board our partners throughout the world, the countries, to coordinate the efforts on how we can find this equipment. It's like in the weapons. It's not so easy and quickly when you can deliver hundreds of tons transformators to replace the ones that have been destroyed. And this coordinated effort that we started a few weeks ago with all of our partners and allies, it is helping us to try to find this equipment, to try to facilitate its delivery to Ukraine so we can restart the normal life of Ukrainian people.
Mm-hmm. And on that point, my colleagues at Politico, they've reported that Ukraine, that the government of Ukraine is privately telling the US government that you will not have enough components and supplies to rebuild the energy grid this winter without US economic aid. And given the changes in Congress and the concern that maybe the Biden administration won't get all the economic aid that they're asking for from Congress, how worried are you about that?
We are confident in all our partners and ourselves to coordinate this effort. The first, what I mentioned, it's not easy to take. And we have here Nancy from the energy sector in Canada, and she knows very well that it's not the equipment that can be easily bought on the market and delivered within a few days to Ukraine. And that's why we are both talking to the governments of all our partners and also to the private sector, saying if it's the same approach as we were dealing with the weapons. If there are the equipment with the companies that was being used and is planned to be replenished in a few months or the years, we would like to take both the used ones, the new ones, or whatever it is in the stock. Sometimes we also are trying to find these creative solutions, which was almost impossible, like from the technical side before the attacks. Now our engineers is also trying to do these innovations to try to feed the equipment, for example, from North America to Ukrainian grid. And it's not only the problem for Ukraine. As we were facing Russia threatening the Europe, Ukraine stepped in and we were ready to export Ukrainian electricity to EU, tried to help EU countries to substitute the deficit of Russian gas. And by these attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, it's actually pushed us to stop exporting electricity because we just don't have it for Ukraine. So it's also a big risk for our European colleagues and our partners, as Ukrainian system is now fully integrated with the European market, that we were eager, but now unfortunately we are not able to help Europe with Ukrainian power.
Mm-hmm. I want to go to Lauren. my colleagues at Politico Europe recently got a lot of backlash for a very provocative piece that they did. They published their Green 28 list of all the regulators, activists, politicians who are greening Europe. And number one on the list, above all the activists and regulators, they listed President Vladimir Putin. And they wrote, "It took a war criminal to speed up Europe's green revolution. Putin has achieved something generations of green campaigners could not. Clean energy is now a fundamental matter of European security." Now, I know it's a little bit more complicated than that, and I'd love for you to just sketch out for us, has this been a bonanza for green energy? Has it been a bonanza for fossil fuels? How has this war changed the trajectory that we're on towards the energy transition?
Thank you. It's a good, it is provocative, but there's something to it, because what I think now everyone can see very clearly is that renewable energy and the energy transition is going to be a major contributor to energy security in Europe, because you're not depending on fossil fuels coming from a country now, a hostile country, an adversary. There are supply chain issues in the renewable sector, in the electricity sector, batteries, et cetera, but I don't think they're at the same critical level as the dependence on Russian gas, which has brought Europe to the place it is today. I think that in terms of what's going to happen tangibly with policy, the EU initial response, 2 weeks after the invasion, there was a first draft of a document called Repower EU, was put out, then it was fleshed out a couple months later, and the response was speed up the energy transition. So we're not only dealing with the loss of Russian gas, but we're also going to speed up moving away from gas altogether and speed up the construction of renewables, et cetera, batteries, and all of that. I think there's a difference between medium-term perspective and short-term. In the medium term, for sure, this is going to speed up as much as it can be sped up, that energy transition investment in renewables. By the way, the EU already had very ambitious targets there. And this is largely issues, there's no problem with capital for that. The capital is there. The issues are really things like permitting and speeding up permitting for renewables projects, which is something European Commission.
Yeah, so is this the opportunity to basically end NIMBYism when it comes to energy infrastructure in Europe? Is that what's going to happen here?
That's the plan. It's hard for the Commission to do that because that's a national level responsibility. But what the Renewable Energy Directive is being revised now, what they're going to say to EU member states is you have to designate a certain area which is a go-to site for renewable development that's sort of pre-permitted, where you're not going to get legal objections and NIMBYism. So that could be very positive. But in the very short term, the crisis we face now, which is a crisis not just for this winter and next winter, and I don't think it's primarily a crisis of freezing in the dark, not having enough gas. Prices are working, price signals are working, demand is down, there's a lot of LNG coming in from around the world. Germany in particular is bringing in a lot more infrastructure very quickly to import more LNG. The problem is price. Gas prices in Europe are very, very high. They're 6 to 8 times what they were back in the normal times. And that's not going to change for a few years. The LNG industry, it takes 4.5 years from the time you take an investment decision till you have a liquefaction plant operating. So the supply of LNG is essentially fixed till about 2026, based on projects that are already underway. And so now you have Europe taking a lot more of this LNG to replace Russian gas. That LNG has to come from somewhere else. And that, I think, is a threat to the energy transition in places like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. Those are the countries that are not getting LNG because it's too expensive. Mm-hmm. And so, first of all, you're having some brownouts, factories shutting in those countries. Again, a direct result of Russia cutting the gas to Europe because there's a global LNG market. And so then the question becomes, how do they cope with this? And the obvious way is to use more coal in the near term. In the very short term, Europe's also using a bit more coal. And so I think in Europe, it's a very short-term issue. And in terms of climate and net zero, things will be back on track pretty quickly. But for the rest of the world, I would be concerned about that.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're sitting here in Canada, a major energy producer of gas and oil. There's been some discussion in this country about whether Canada should be providing more LNG, setting itself up to provide more to its allies. Is that, would that be a smart decision, or given the timelines involved, will that not make a difference?
Well, I mean, I think obviously it would help. Again, there's this 4.5 year timeline, so it's not going to, nothing Canada can do or nothing the U.S. can do right now is going to contribute in the next 1 or 2 years in terms of more LNG supply. Going forward, for sure. I mean, the problem is in North America and Canada and the U.S. too, it's really, really hard to build new transmission pipelines. And in the U.S., you know, you've got a lot of gas in Appalachia that's stuck there because nobody's can get a pipeline built out of there. You have the Northeast still importing LNG because you can't build pipelines. So it's a similar problem in Canada.
Mm-hmm. I want to turn to General Andrzejczyk for the view from Poland. You know, being born in Poland myself, I'm very interested in your view here on how vulnerable is Poland right now, both from a security perspective and an energy security perspective, and what are you doing to increase your security right now?
Thank you. A lot of efforts Poland put last couple of years to be independent in energy, which makes me happy as a citizen of Poland because we have a lot of investments, but also a lot of challenges how to secure this infrastructure. And this is the great example that everything is about energy. So Poland invested heavily in the LNG terminal in Świnoujście, north part of Poland. And there will be a big connection, the blue pipe connected to the Norway gas. And finally, if there's operational, we will be very independent concerning gas, as well as Gdańsk and Gdynia, which is the city you know very well, a lot of terminals and infrastructure. And I think we are a pretty good example how to invest properly attention and energy, kind of energy of a state to increase the energy independence. But as well, it's very important to synchronize investments with the discussion how to secure the recent events when we saw in the Nord Stream 2 is you know, the explosions, this disaster that is very vulnerable. And I'm not sure it's necessarily Army job for Navy, but we are experts to design the system to be secure. How vulnerable it is, the Ukraine is a perfect example, is extremely important.
And how much is the climate conversation coming into Poland's energy planning, or is it very much a security conversation?
Well, this is a very, very difficult question, and I would say, like in the Muppet Show, it's not easy to be green. I'm green. It's a typical question for politicians and for the energy experts, and I think, yes, of course, it goes that direction. Although Poland is very land-heavy, ground-oriented north, relatively, if you look in the region, but the situation and the climate change in Africa immediately goes to the migrations and the people going from a certain direction is a mission for European Union, for NATO, absorbing our resources and so on. So everything is interconnected. Anything happen in Africa, pretty soon concerning climate goes to the migration, goes to the food issues. So we as the main experts of security have to be very, very close to those issues. So.
Well, the ambassador was talking about the difficulties of rebuilding the electricity grid, the logistics, the supply chain issues. And Poland is serving as a big logistics hub on its border, where most recently we had these errant missiles come and kill 2 Polish citizens. Can you just give us here at the forum just a description of what that looks like there on the ground right now? How secure is that logistics hub? And in light of these recent missiles, are you doing anything differently to secure that operation? And what do you think allies should be doing to help secure that logistics area there near Rzeszów that we discussed the other day?
It is. So you don't have problems to pronounce the Rzeszów, but around the globe that is most well known as a J town. It's easier to.
It's about 6 consonants in a row.
Yes. Right? So from the very beginning, in the first day, Poland realized that we have 2 missions in 2 directions. One is to help the situation when the Ukrainians are going in the western direction. More than 6 million Ukrainians cross the Polish border. There was one mission. A second mission was to support any kind of transportation and supplies to Ukraine. So most of the equipment, most of the ammunition, tanks, artillery assets, and the medical stuff is going through this lovely town. So immediately we set up the very effective logistic base, and first issue was security. So the United States' contribution to helping us in the building this protection system together with the British component is absolutely critical. So now it's very effective, but the very important message for everybody here is that Poland took a very high level of strategical risk building so close, it's not so far away, the city you come from, in the other side of a border. And the protection and the sending a much stronger, I would say, message to Russia is needed right now. The incident we observed a couple of days before is the conclusion that Russia is escalating and is going closer and closer to the NATO borders. I would say winter is coming, not necessarily only as a season, but in much wider meaning, winter is coming to the borders, and this is the mission for us.
Mm-hmm. I mean, what are you looking for from allies? Are you looking for a no-fly zone there? Like, what do you want to see in terms of securing that area?
It's again, it's not easy to be a green, but I would say we need more developed discussion in the strategical level to realize if we helping enough Ukraine. Technically, from the point of infrastructure, our efforts, Poland is second donator as a nation, and we send a lot of equipment, but I would inspire other countries as well to do the same scale of support for Ukraine. Ukraine has to win. That's our mission, full stop. And this is the question for us, is it enough or not, what we're doing?
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of the logistics, Nancy, ATCO plays a big role in helping, whether it's military or humanitarian aid around the world. How are you looking at the energy security situation from where you sit?
I was really struck yesterday by Admiral Bauer's comments on the lack of preparedness of industry to address the supply issues for munitions and defense weaponry. I also am very struck by the lack of preparedness to deal with energy transition today and also have industry ready for war. The amount of investment and time and machinery that is being taken up to do grid transformation and energy transition around the world is really quite remarkable. It's slow. It's not where we would like it to be. It is a massive undertaking to achieve a net zero world by 2050, massive, trillions of dollars, that many policymakers don't really understand the practicality of that. And quite frankly, industry has never been brought into the conversation with regards to security and the readiness and stores of supplies that are required in a situation that we're experiencing today. Transformers around the world, we have hurricanes, we have all kinds of weather events. They are in short supply, and they require real expertise to get countries like the Ukraine back up and running. Generators that are modular and mobile. And quite frankly, in the middle of the Ukraine, in an active theater of war, where are we going to get or be able to build renewables? It's not possible. We're going to have to rely on fossil fuels to be able to make sure those generators are producing electricity to support the water supply system, to support agriculture, to support the technology. And I think from my perspective, our company is making a big bet on hydrogen, renewables, clean technology around the world, Australia, Canada, Puerto Rico, Chile. But we have not been brought into a conversation by government or defense as to how we get prepared for situations like we're experiencing with the Ukraine today. And I think that, I have been a big proponent of bringing industry to the table to make sure that we can be prepared. And today we are seeing the consequences of that lack of preparation.
What do you blame that on?
I am a climate change believer, number one. Net zero is a noble goal, I think we heard on the video. Right, today it's aspirational, and policymakers, I've been a participant at COP on several occasions, but policymakers are not listening to what the practical aspects of costs and affordability and reliability, for both on the defense side, but from a practical side for nations being able to continue in the way that they have and progress to the future that we want. So I think there's been a de-link between policymakers. There's a lack of mandate by regulators to follow the net zero, and then there's a lack of understanding of the preparedness that we need. So I blame all of us, but I think this crisis in the Ukraine is a rallying cry for all of us to work much closer together and collaborate on what we can bring to the table in order to assist each other in making this world a better place and a safer place.
Well, Sir Michael, obviously the world is arming itself right now in view of this war. Poland has ramped up its acquisition, going around the world, even to Korea, to find all kinds of armaments. When they come to Boeing and ask for fighter jets or munition systems or whatever, how often do these governments ask you the carbon footprint? Does that ever come up in the conversation?
A good question. Thank you, Riza. But before I answer that, just a word of thanks to Peter, hats off to Peter and the team for putting this on the agenda. I think this long-term energy impact on security is, these two are inseparable. Now we see it today with Ukraine, which where we talked, but as the General picked up, what happens when Africa starts migrating? What happens when Bangladesh starts flooding? There's a serious long-term security issue. So I'm really pleased that Halifax is gripping with this. And I think Nancy mentioned the point about the long-term challenge, and we're not yet gripping it. I mean, some governments are trying to do that. Look at John Kerry's First Movers Coalition with the World Economic Forum in Davos. I mean, they're trying to get us all on the same page to do it, but the journey is a difficult one. So to your question, when governments come in a hurry wanting planes for Ukrainian war, sustainability is not top of their list. But I think the mood in the world is changing. In aviation is a small part of this debate, but we've become the sort of focal point for that because, well, you can see aeroplanes with contrails and so on. We're 3% of the output of CO2, but we're tackling it. And governments aren't yet asking that. They're beginning to, but for the longer term. But the airlines are, because customers want to be green when they fly. And I mean, 80% of the world has never set foot in an airplane. They deserve to fly, they want to fly, but they've got to fly green, to your net zero point. So we're all working on that quite hard, and gradually we've got to set a target for the industry as a whole. Governments have agreed that in ICAO, by 2050 we will fly green, to net zero, and we've got a roadmap to get there, but as Nancy says, it's tough. I can give you some detail later if you'd like. But,
Well, one thing I'm wondering about is, all these technologies of the future need a lot of natural resources, right, to build the batteries and so on. And it's a conversation around supply chains that we've been having since COVID as well, right? And this realization that, oh, wait, China actually controls the refining of so many of these critical materials that we need. And I wonder, how are you, and and your company looking at your supply chains as you're thinking to the future of whatever it is, electric planes or more efficient engines? You need a lot of metals and minerals. Where are you going to source them, and how are you thinking about those supply chains?
I mean, before we get on to the next generation, the current generation has a problem with titanium because a third of the world's titanium very good titanium, came from Russia. So day 2 of the invasion, we cut off all our offtake of supply. We had a joint venture in Siberia, and we stopped it. And so we're now sourcing elsewhere in the world where we can find aerospace-grade titanium. Actually, fun enough, we're looking with Canada at developing somewhere in Canada, which is quite exciting. So it's not just about the rare earths, which you mentioned from China, but they are very important because for the future of lots of things, but including flight, where electric batteries are going to be required, components for that need rare earths, and China has a lot of sources of those. There are other sources around the world, and we're all looking very carefully to make sure that we have adequate supplies. And that is the future for cars and for aviation.
Can I just add to that, Lisa? Companies like Boeing are very adept at large-scale, rapid expansion from a factory perspective. And manufacturing is actually one of those areas that I believe we could retool quickly to help provide more munitions and deploy more products that are required. The minerals that are required in Canada today, one of those mines for a titanium or any of the rare earth minerals takes about 15 years to actually be commissioned. The permit and license, because of the green advocacy, not climate change, green advocacy against developing our resources, is so difficult to get through. And then on another level, in Canada, we also have a duty to consult and actually partner with our Indigenous peoples, which is a good thing, but it does take time. And so if we need rapid response, which is what we need in wartime situations, from industry, from civilians, from our defense, and we look to our defense, our military force, our armed forces, to respond, we have to find a better way to deliver.
Well, go ahead.
I was going to come in on, I mean, you're talking about urgent military equipment, but this pressure for green in the longer term, I'm now talking commercial. Let's go back to titanium. You have it in Canada, sponge, it's got to be developed and then certified. And for aerospace, we use 10 to the minus 9 as a safety criteria. That's pretty demanding. And titanium like that is just one example, lots of rare earth equivalents. You've got a huge amount of infrastructure investment which takes time to put in place. You can't flick your fingers and go green, that's the trouble.
But I want to ask Lauren, haven't we been having this conversation for as long as I can remember? I mean, we want to go green, but it's hard. It's so hard. It takes time. I mean, are we, given that the timeline is not ours to choose, right? I mean, the warming of the Earth is happening. It is being documented, and every year we're losing time. So where are we on that timeline? And how much do we need to accelerate?
Well, one positive thing, the earlier, the old problem has been solved, which is that wind and solar were expensive. They had to be subsidized. That's finished. Wind and solar are cheap, and that's very, very clear. So now we've moved on. We have the luxury of worrying about these second order problems, which are also critical, but the supply chain and all of this. And also the capital markets. I mean, there's a good and a bad to ESG and capital markets. There's a lot of money available for renewable projects. There's a lot of money that financial institutions want to deploy there. And we've heard from Admiral Bauer yesterday that does that really make sense for ESG, for you not being able to invest in arms that are needed to defend Europe? It's the same thing, obviously, with oil and gas, where now everyone can see maybe it wasn't such a good idea. The shortage of gas in the world today was obviously caused by Vladimir Putin, but the fact that there was underinvestment for a few years because of ESG trends is also not very helpful. I think this final point that obviously industry is part of the solution. I mean, your words, Nancy, very clearly the case that there's been a tendency, you're speaking of not bringing industry into the dialogue, but there's also a tendency in terms of the energy transition to exclude or think oil and gas companies don't have a role to play. Of course they have a role to play. I think that's becoming more and more understood over time, but they have, first of all, they've got enormous cash flow right now because of high gas prices, high oil prices. So that's cash flow that many of those big, let's call them energy companies, now not oil and gas companies, that they're deploying to support the energy transition. And of course they have critical skills in terms of carbon capture and storage, in terms of hydrogen, those companies have to be part of the solution. So it's part of the discussion we were hearing before.
Great. Well, I want the audience to start thinking of their questions, and we'll take questions in 1 second. I would just like to ask the ambassador, when you look forward, what does energy security for Ukraine look like? What would you like to see after this war?
The Ukraine, like historically, we were suffering from the Russian energy war for over the decades. And I would like to remind that 3 times in the middle of winter, around the 1st of January, Russia totally cut off gas supply to Ukraine, demanding some of the political bargain. And unfortunately, in 2012, Russia's policy to Ukraine was to sell Ukraine as much as possible politically cheap Russian gas and to trade with Ukrainian governments at that time to increasing Russian political presence in Ukraine. And unfortunately, we do already paid a huge price. In 2012, when Russia offered to Ukrainian, at that time, president, a cheap gas contract, which is of course very favorable for any politician, they asked to prolong the basing of the Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. And that was used to increase Russia's presence in Crimea. And led to the occupation of Crimea in 2014. That is a very painful story Ukraine lived through and understood how much Russia was playing and using energy as a political weapon. We were very loudly, together with our Polish colleagues, advocating against Nord Stream, especially the Nord Stream 2, because we understood that by leveraging the countries with cheap Russian gas, they undermine the efforts for the green transition, then undermine the efforts on the energy security and diversification for both the conventional energy resources and the renewable one. And unfortunately, it only became so clear when Russia invaded into Ukraine. And the first thing they actually destroyed in Ukraine is 90% of the wind farms and 50% of the solar farms.
Very intentionally.
Very intentionally understanding that as we were moving to diversification of the energy, they just started to destroy specifically the green energy. Because if we look on Russia, the major revenues Russia is getting and actually using to wage the war is the oil and gas revenues. And we are on the edge of this sixth package of European sanctions banning Russian oil, and the price cap is under the discussion. It is important to deprive Russia from these huge revenues, which are exceeding $100 billion only this year. But if we are looking on the rebuilding, we were ambitious on the renewables. Before the war, Ukraine had around 11% of the renewables in overall energy mix. We had the plan to increase them by 2030 around 20. We were building around 2 gigawatts a year before the war. So the speed was quite big, especially in the wind, and we have this climate capacity to build it. And after the rebuilding, there is a positive thing. We will have a chance to not only rebuild, but build better. And
build back better.
Build it better. And build it better is also a part of the build better energy. Build more secure, more addressing the climate change, and taking the best technology. This both the classical renewable wind and solar, but also the hydrogen, but also the biomass. Ukraine is amongst top 10 agri-countries. And the biomass and the biogas is actually very natural for us as Ukraine to be self-reliant on the energy. And that we see as our future. We will build this better.
Sir Michael.
I just wanted to add one point. The ambassador makes a really clear example of the interrelationship of energy and political pressure. And I just think if you look at the wider global picture over the next generation, good example recently, Australia and China, Australian coal to China, got very caught up in politics. Iran, we spoke about this morning, single biggest export is to China. Saudi Arabia, ditto. India is now trying to become more independent as their economy grows. I think this energy politics relationship around the world is just a crucial issue for Halifax to think about.
And it's an incredible way to think about how geopolitics will change once we get. Go ahead, General.
If I may just, a few comments. I got a feeling that we are representing the other hemisphere and very close to the danger. Let's take some strategical perspective. 2008, Russia invades Georgia, and my president is going to the Georgia, and he says 2008, and he says today Georgia, tomorrow Ukraine, 2008, and then is probably Baltic states, and one day maybe my country. He said that point at 2008. We lost him 2010 and as small as Russia in the presidential crash. And what the punishment we prepare for Russia for such a situation? Nord Stream 1, it was a kind of a punishment. And then everything is going exactly what he said is going to Ukraine, 2014. And we are not happy with the situation we see. What kind of punishment we prepare for him is a Nord Stream 2. And then we have a 2022, 24th of February. And before we go with the important questions, I would put some question, what kind of punishment we're gonna prepare for Russia today? Thank you.
Scotty Greenwood.
Thank you so much. My question is, maybe for the private sector participants in the panel, what does ideal public-private collaboration look like when we are trying to replace Russian energy, when we're trying to decouple with China? Nancy Southern said 15 years is too long to permit a facility. I couldn't agree more. So if you could design an ideal collaboration for energy security for the world and for the crisis in Ukraine, what does government need to do differently? We know the Pentagon is trying to de-risk some capital, but what should it look like? Thank you.
Thank you. I think industry and the and policymakers in politics could take a lot of lessons and a lot of learnings out of training and preparation, planning from our armed forces. They are the most well-trained of all of us in terms of thinking about scenarios and the PERT chart or Gantt chart, whatever you want to call it. If action A happens, we have 3 options, and we have front-end loaded the decision-making about those 3 options. And I don't think in politics or in industry we have that same training to think long-term strategic, action-oriented planning. So I would actually ask, first of all, once you get finished looking after the world for us, that we find a way, and I think I know in our company we've learned a lot by taking on veterans from the forces that are teaching us about this preparedness and planning and strategic outlooks. So that's really, I think we need to start from the fact that we don't have that training to the same degree, either in politics or in industry.
I think we had a question from a gentleman at the back.
Hi, my name's Cody Blois. I'm the Member of Parliament from King's Hands, just outside of Halifax, and chair of the House of Commons Agriculture Committee. Nancy, I can't agree more on the regulatory piece, so we should talk after and see what I could do to help in Parliament to help drive that with some of my colleagues. I missed the first 10 minutes of the remarks, but I didn't hear a whole lot on nuclear. And I think about Canada, whether it be Cameco and some of the opportunities. And by the way, I agree, certainly hydrogen is where we're moving, huge opportunities here in the Atlantic. But I'm perplexed sometimes to see countries in Europe that seem to be stepping back on nuclear to focus on coal or other fossil fuels. Any comments from the panel, whether it be some of the folks on the energy side? When I look at North America and the uranium deposits that exist in Canada, along with our shared expertise, I see opportunities to not only have that as amongst our allies, but certainly to help the world. Any comments?
Juliana.
So from Ukraine's perspective, Ukraine, before the war, was producing over 50% of all our electricity from the nuclear. What we have been doing for the last 10 years, as for the gas, just not buying it at Russia and diversifying the flow, the same we understood that it's also, because they were built in the Soviet Union, most of them, on Russian technology, we understood that this is a risk. And the risk on the nuclear side is much higher. So we diversified the flow of nuclear fuel, making them both US and part on the other sources. And since we now understand the huge risk, especially around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which has been few times shelling, so there were the missiles just few hundred meters from the reactor. And this, I would like to remind, the biggest nuclear plant in Europe. We understand that after the occupation of Zaporizhzhia nuclear, which is an essential point that also EIAA mission declared and said, for the sake of nuclear security, we will need to maintain and work a lot on the Zaporizhzhia. But also the nuclear technology is coming forward. We see this technology on the module nuclear reactors, much smaller, that can be deployed in different parts of the countries, and we are also looking at it as a future for our rebuilding, and looking on that technology that can play a big role both in Ukraine, and our Polish colleagues just made their decision to go to the new nuclear power, understanding about the energy threats and the need to diversify. So from our perspective, we see that nuclear still plays a big role in Ukraine, and it will continue to play that role.
Mm-hmm. Sir Michael.
So a quick comment on that. Not on nuclear. I don't think you want us to fly aeroplanes on nuclear power. But from where you represent in Canada, I think Canada has a huge opportunity on the next generation of aviation fuel, sustainable aviation fuels, and there are lots of ways to make that, but you have a lot of the ingredients here in this part of the world, and we're looking at that with Canada. Just pass on to you.
Sir Michael, when are we going to get electric planes?
I mean,
No, I live on the flight path from Reagan Airport. This is quite
that's great. We're making one at the moment, actually, and some engineers in Montreal are helping us do it. So we are developing an eVTOL, electric vertical takeoff taxi, 12 little rotors that lift it up, another one that pushes it along. Very silent, it's about as loud as a car, and it will be autonomous. And the idea is that you have hundreds of these things buzzing across cities to and from the airport.
Okay, I'm not sure if I'm excited or scared now.
Well, you could have a pilot if you like, but we're going to make it so you don't have to. And we're planning to bring that to market this decade. So very
This
exciting,
decade?
yeah.
Wow. All right. Do we have a question on this side? Oh, lots of questions. Right here in the front.
My question is about the capacity or the natural endowments of some nation states to make that energy transition. Some states are more endowed or in a better position, whether it be land space, sun, wind. How is this another form of division in the world, haves and have-nots? Is there potential for state-on-state disharmony as a result of that division, and what can we do as a global community to overcome that so that we're not creating further divisions in the world?
Great question. I mean, Lauren, this is a big issue at COP, right? What are the responsibilities of some countries versus others? How do you look at that question?
Well, first of all, that's right. That was the key issue that sort of got, there was a statement at the end about responsibility for lower income countries. But I think the question you're asking, it's true. And I don't think it's going to recreate dependence on oil and gas that led to dependence on certain countries, because I think there's a big problem in the supply chain with minerals, but those minerals are all over the place. We just need to find them, mine them, and fix this permitting issue that takes 15 years to do. So I think that one will slowly get addressed. The US has done some of that with the IRA. Europe has been looking at this for a long time, trying to take action there. The other one, I think in Europe, from the European perspective, the European transition to hydrogen, there's an acknowledgement that green hydrogen, hydrogen produced using clean electricity and electrolysis, that the resources in Europe are not sufficient for that. So Europe is trying to build partnerships with countries, that have tremendous solar, wind potential. North Africa, Namibia is a big focus of attention now. And then the question is a technical one, transporting that to Europe. And that's when I think the jury's still out how that's going to be done. But that's the sort of thing that businesses know how to solve if the capital is there, which it is, and if the determination is there.
But Laurent, the question of where you get the water for electrolysis also has not been solved. And so I think your point on have and have not countries with regards to energy transition is a really important one. And you have to look at the geographic region and the ability of that region to actually be able to do electrolysis to produce hydrogen. Yes, there's plenty of sunshine. There's all kinds of deserts around the world and more coming. But where is the water for the electrolysis? And quite frankly, clean hydrogen, which now Europe has gone to say, okay, blue hydrogen is okay. Carbon capture is a natural. In the province that you and I come from, last year, a year ago next month in December, 3 weeks of average temperature of minus 23 degrees centigrade. 3 weeks. We have a grid with a capacity of 18 gigawatts. Peak load for the electricity was 15 gigawatts. The equivalent for home heating was 50 gigawatts of electricity that we use natural gas for. Now, trying to replace that without using that very fuel to create a new generation of energy by carbon capture and producing hydrogen is foolhardy. It is in abundance, and the reason that we would use it is because we have all the infrastructure available to use it. It isn't a full capital stock turnover. In Australia, you have to build desalination plants in order to get enough water to produce the hydrogen. But I think, quite frankly, and you need base load electricity in order to offset the intermittency of sun and wind. One question I had for the general, though, is how is he going to, or all of you, in your maneuvers, in what you have to do and propel your ships, what fuel are you going to use in the future when the Russians and the Chinese target the grid? Is there a refueling station for you that is going to power your tanks with electricity? I think we all have to come together to figure this out. And which countries have what access to what energy is a key question.
Sir Michael, final
I just want to finish on an optimistic note. I mean, I think
Thank you
could write a story.
We're all grateful.
Seriously, I think you can write a story that the history of humankind is based around a competition for energy. And I tell my grandchildren, I've got lots of them, that I think in their lifetime, for the first time in human history, we'll have unlimited energy at marginal cost. Now, the technology you lot will help sort it out, but I think it's coming. And that transforms geopolitics, apart from anything else. And you desalinate in Australia, and away you go. But anyway, that's my optimism.
Well, thank you, everyone. This has been a great beginning to what I think is one of the most important conversations that we can be having right now. And thank you to Peter and the Forum for putting this on. And I hope we'll come back next year and check in on progress and hopefully with happier news at that time. So thank you all so very much. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.